You're listening to the Better for America podcast, presented by Amac, the Association of Mature American Citizens.
Hello, everyone. I'm Rebecca Weber. This is your Amac podcast, Better for America. And today we have with us an embodiment of the American dream, a leader who rose from ideas and dreams to becoming a doer and an example of what is possible. I'm talking about Trey Hollingsworth, Congressman from Indiana's 9th District. Now, in the heartland, Congressman Hollingsworth rehabilitated abandoned industrial sites. He teamed with local talent. He created an extraordinary aluminum manufacturing business, producing over 1.8 billion pounds of aluminum in 2008, and reaching higher as a believer in the American idea and the American dream. Congressman Hollingsworth ran for Congress on the principle that government belongs to the people, not the other way around. He is a constitutionalist in the best sense of the word, and is somebody who literally wants all Americans to succeed. And this congressman seems cut from the mantra and priorities of Ronald Reagan, who it's often said that Reagan was an elected president on 6 words: smaller government, lower taxes, strong defense. The priority of fiscal conservatives and those who believe in limited government, as our 2.4 million AMAC members do, is to return the power to the people, not take it from the people. So it is my great pleasure to introduce somebody who believes in that as well. From a vigorous economy to term limits, the distinguished Congressman from the Indiana's 9th District, Trey Hollingsworth. Thank you so much for being with us today, Congressman.
Well, I'm delighted to be here. Thanks for that wonderful introduction. And again, thank you guys for all that you're doing all the way across the country in Indiana's 9th and from sea to shining sea, in sharing those values that made this country great for 240 years and are going to ensure it continues to be great. So thank you for what you do every day.
Well, thank you for that. So I do want to start from the top, Congressman. You do represent the American dream, which is the idea that if you have vision, if you have hard work, and if you're persistent, that really anything can be done. So for starters, maybe you can take us through your own rise from a time when you had an idea, essentially, and that led you to become a very successful businessman, and then on to Congress. And so share with us, if you could, the origins and depth of belief in that thing that we call the American dream.
Absolutely. Well, I'll tell you what, it started first and foremost with a belief in the American worker. Back when I began my business in 2003, 2004, everyone everywhere was talking about how we needed to move manufacturing overseas, how the American worker couldn't compete alongside foreign workers. And I knew that wasn't the case. I knew the problem was we had too many rocks in the backpack of the American worker in terms of higher regulatory environment, higher taxes, more challenging workplace. But the American worker would be able to prevail if only we gave them that level playing field. And so from my perspective, belief in the American dream starts with belief in the American worker, that the American worker can outcompete anybody around the world, out-innovate anybody around the world, and develop a better, brighter future for themselves, for that enterprise, for their community, and for this country overall. And that belief in the American worker, first and foremost, is what led me to these old abandoned manufacturing and distribution sites that people left behind as they'd gone overseas. And so I sought to rehabilitate those, repurpose those, find new ways for them to be useful again in these communities all the way across our country. And it was so powerful for me to see as those companies realized that they should be coming back, bringing back manufacturing, bringing back distribution, bringing back goods production in the United States, that the American workers were right there able to make those products yet again. And so I was really excited about my participation in that, and frankly, seeing the resurgence of American prosperity again.
What a wonderful story, really. That is inspiring. And you've done what so many Americans in various ways every day aim to really do. That is focus on a dream, make a meaningful difference in the lives of others. So, Congressman, you often talk about returning to limited government and remembering real power lies in the people, not the federal government. And that reminds us of what our nearly forgotten, I guess you could say, 10th Amendment says, that powers not expressly given to the federal government belong to the states and to the people. So in a time when federal spending is really out of control and we see left-leaning members of Congress, they're intent on aggregating power, not giving this power to the people, your message seems really unusually timely. So it is, of course, a great message of fiscal conservatives. Go ahead.
Absolutely. Well, I tell you what, that is exactly right. It's not only my fervent belief in the American worker that really animated everything I did from a business perspective, but everything in Congress that I have done has been animated from the central view that it is Americans that make this country great, right? No one wakes up in the morning and thinks what has made America great for 240 years are 535 Yahoo politicians in DC. Nobody thinks that. I asked that question all the way across the country, and everyone in real America knows and understands that the greatness of this country is derived from the greatness and hard work and effort of the American people themselves. And so why should we have a government that doesn't respect them, that doesn't help them, that doesn't enable them, that frankly doesn't provide them the freedom to be able to do just that? And we provide them the freedom by limiting federal government. And I've seen my colleagues in my 5 years up here in Washington constantly taking more and more power away from the American people instead of giving more and more power to the American people. We just saw it in the last week with the elections bill that Biden tried to ram through the Senate, again, trying to aggregate more and more power in Washington, D.C., instead of devolving power to the states, devolving power to municipalities, devolving power, frankly, to the voter themselves. And I watched in horror as this federal government over the last couple of decades has sought to consolidate more inside the Beltway instead of recognizing what I think is the fury of the American people at seeing their power, their greatness, not being led by a Washington, D.C. that works, but instead being marred by a Washington, D.C. that doesn't work.
Yeah. Here at AMAC, we really do understand, and those listening get it, that growth and freedom and who we are as a country depends on a smaller, more limited government, an accountable government, not the reverse. And so we know that our strength is in our people, not big government. So thank you again, Congressman. I think a lot of these truths are very self-evident. But it's good for us to be reminded now and again. So thank you. I do want to turn to policy for a quick moment, lean on your expertise, if we may. So you come from the private sector, you understand how business works, and now you're in government. And I'm sure that comes with considerable frustration, right? So what are some of the lessons that you've learned in the private sector that should be applied at the federal level? Can you share that contrast with us? Because you must see it every day.
Absolutely. And frustration is a great word for it. We need a government that works. We have for too long had a government that doesn't really work, that isn't solving the problems that matter most to Americans. You can see it
Right.
every single day out of this Biden administration that is focused on so many of their own obsessions instead of the things that Americans are challenged with, whether it's at the pump, at the grocery stores, in their community with crime, an economy that doesn't seem to be sputtering ahead like they want it to. All of these things challenge them every single day. None of these things seem to be the things that Biden is waking up thinking about. I have to tell you, in the contrast with private sector versus public sector, it couldn't be larger. And some of the lessons I took from the private sector that have mattered most to me in government is, number one, we've already talked about, solving the problem at the lowest possible level. Those that can solve the problem at the local level, those problems should be solved at the local level, should be solved at the state level, they can be solved at the state level. And only the very few things that have to be solved at the federal level should be solved at the federal level. So number one, you've already brought it up, making sure that the people who can solve the problem at the lowest possible level are the people given the power to do so. Number two, and this is hugely important, incentive structure matters. We know this in the private sector, right? If you say, we're going to give you an enormous bonus if you do X, Y, and Z, by God, people do X, Y, and Z. And the problem in Washington, D.C. is the misaligned incentives. This is why I've been such a huge advocate of term limits. This is why I've been such a huge advocate of lobbying bans, because the incentive structure in D.C. is not to empower and enable the American people. It is to empower and enable career politicians to build their careers on the backs of the American people who are working hard and sending that $4 trillion every single year to the federal government. We've got to make sure we realign the incentive structure so that every day, every member of Congress wakes up thinking about one simple thing. How do I advance the interests of my constituents in America as a whole? Right now, we've got every single member of Congress waking up thinking about how they can advance their own career, how they can advance their own agenda, how they can advance their next lobbying career instead of focused on the American people. So number two is the alignment of incentives. And then I think number three is accountability. There's so little accountability in Washington writ large, not just in Congress, but in these agencies where they aren't held to task for, you said you were going to deliver X, but we instead got Y, right? Why is
Right.
that? How do we go back? How do we reverse engineer that? I think the third thing we've got to drive home to our government is a level of accountability. We see this in the private sector, and we want to make sure it's replicated in the public sector where you are accountable for delivering results and you get terminated if you don't deliver results.
Congressman, I believe you have also pledged not to serve more than 4 terms, which of course I think that does echo the sentiments of our founders concerning service in Washington. And it reminds me of Thomas Jefferson and his thinking that a limited time serving was a duty. So I understand how you came to that view, but do you think that we'll ever get to a point again where these professional politicians, like our current president, who literally has made a fortune off of taxpayer dollars, serving Washington his entire life from his 20s, how do we convince people that service should be for a limited time? Because that is really how our republic was designed, was it not?
No, you are exactly right to say that. You were exactly right to say that it is how it has been designed. The problem it has been perverted by these career politicians to use for their own purposes instead of the beautiful, elegant system of government that was originally envisioned by our founders. And so returning to that vision, I think, is something the American people don't need to be convinced of, but are already convinced of and are coming for that very aim. I think more and more Americans, every poll that I see, recognize that fundamentally at the core of the issues that exist in Washington is this misalignment of interest, as you talked about, this vision that people in government are waking up for their own ends instead of the bettering of ends for the American people. I've seen polls that say 84% of Americans, that's not 84% of Republicans, not 84% of Democrats, not 84% of independents, 84% of Americans believe that term limits are necessary for government to be restored in the fashion that it was originally envisioned for, it to work again for them. And I think we're seeing every single election, more and more members of Congress that are committed to term limits, right? 20 years ago, you saw maybe a dozen people on these bills. Now we're up to 80, 90. Now we're not at a majority yet, right? We're not at 217, but we're inching our way closer. And I think every single election, we're seeing more and more angry voters that are not just frustrated with the particular policy they see in Washington, but are frustrated by what is animating all of the policy discussion in Washington because it's so divorced from what they are discussing at their kitchen table. So I am really optimistic, maybe not next Congress, maybe not the Congress after that, that we are going to get there because I see more and more voters across this country that are angry and want their power and country back.
That's right. That's a very good grounded view on really how our government should work. And AMAC members and those engaged with us are frustrated because they recognize, like I have a list here. We called, our members called the American Rescue Plan the crippling inflation plan. They call the Build Back Better plan the Build Back Broke plan. AMAC members called the infrastructure bill the Everything But Roads and Bridges Act. We go on and on and on. The American Dream and Promise Act, that was the Open Borders Act. We hear the media that asks our president questions like, why are the Republicans preventing you from being able to secure voting rights in America? So for somebody who's not tuned in day to day, you hear the word secure voting rights, sounds good. When in fact, what our government, what our administration is looking to do is federally take over our elections. Again, taking more from the people. And this is not the will of the people. The will of the people is the majority of people want voter ID, including minorities. They say there's no problem. We should have to show a license or some other form of identification. And we want to reduce at all, in every way we can. We want to reduce fraud, not encourage fraud. So I do think that oftentimes the way that Washington and the media, mainstream media, present these bad policies and ideas is really disinformation to the American people. So I want to ask you an angle on that question, whether our government is working or not, because some Americans would say that a president aggregating power to really himself with executive actions, for example, issuing federal mandates that punish private sector employers if they don't impinge on an employee's constitutional right. We think that's just wrong. And some Americans and many AMAC members would consider that government overreach, trying to break a 150-year-old filibuster in order to jam through unpopular legislation. So we see that. How do we get back to making our government work for the people? We need more transparency, clearly, but where do we start?
Well, I tell you what, you guys have already started, and you should be commended for that, because where this starts is by educating our citizenry, by helping them get informed about what are the real issues, what are the things that are really going on in Washington. We're not going to convince Joe Biden, a multi-decade politician, to suddenly change his ways, right? We're not going to suddenly convince agency heads that are well-entrenched bureaucrats in Washington to suddenly change their ways. What we are going to do is to convince Mary in Paoli that this is important enough for her to show up and vote for the first time. What we're going to do is convince Jim in Omaha that he needs to donate $100 to the candidate that reflects his values. What we're going to do is convince Tim in Wisconsin that it matters enough for him to go out and campaign for his local candidate. What we are going to do is help the American people understand that this is broken, and it is our responsibility to get it back. You guys are doing that. I see it every single day in district already. I've done 2 town halls last year with AMAC members alone, and we didn't have 10 people showed up. We had 100 people show up at each. I was so proud to see so many people out, engaged, excited, not just about what they see in Washington that's not working and how they can fix it, but excited about remaining engaged until this fight is over. And so you're already doing it. We just need more and more Americans to wake up and see that this will not change unless they force it to change. We cannot rely on those that built this system over the last 30, 40 years in Washington to tear it down. We have to rely on Americans to say, we've seen the results you've gotten. We don't like those results. Let's do what our founders intended to get back to that.
Well, thank you. Thank you for offering that realism and optimism as well. And so the way 2022 is going, it looks like many Americans are really waking up. We discussed that, and reassessing the Biden White House and this Democrat-led Congress. If you were able to peer into your crystal ball, do you see the House and Senate flipping in November of this year?
Well, my crystal ball is no clearer than anybody else's, but I will tell you what I hear every single day as I travel the district, as I go to the grocery stores, I meet with businesses, as I meet with senior citizens, and that is a level of enthusiasm that I've never seen before, a level of enthusiasm to say, I want this back. What I have seen over the last year terrifies me. The challenges that exist for this country are only growing, not lessening, under this unified Democrat control. And furthermore, they're not working on the challenges that do exist. They're working on their own obsessions, despite the wild unpopularity of those obsessions. So I believe very firmly that we are going to have a great 2022 election and bring home the start of how we turn this country back in the direction that Americans want to see it. Poll after poll shows the grave unpopularity of the proposals that the Biden administration's put forward. Poll after poll indicates more the independents that were duped into voting for Biden as the great unifier or as the great problem solver have recognized the error of that particular decision and want to see real and genuine change in a different direction. And I hope that not only will we get back the House and Senate later this year, but that we'll do the real things that Americans have requested that we do. The Americans have said that matter to them. And so I'm not only optimistic that we'll get it back, but I'm really hopeful we can then utilize that, mobilize that to the betterment of this country. There's never been a day that America hasn't been challenged. There's never been a day that we haven't faced really big challenges. But I think just like this year, Americans will rise to those challenges. Americans will show up and put their paper in the ballot box and say, we are better than this. We can do better than this. We deserve better than this.
Well, that's great, Congressman. Thank you so much for your inspiration. I do have one last question for you. I think AMAC members are really frustrated. They see so many bad policies here in America. We see that we have international threats. We understand that China is of great concern. Uh, Talking here at home, however, here in America, what would you consider one of the bigger threats that we ought to be really paying attention to? Is it America's loss of energy independence? Is it wide open borders? Is it the rising cost of food and gasoline and inflation? What would you see as something that we ought to be tackling now, not later? Because there are so many areas that we need to focus. And of course, crime, we see that rising crime across the nation. So there are a number of areas that AMAC is focused. And for those listening, what would you, in your position, what would you consider something that ought to be addressed right away that the Biden administration is not tackling?
Look, for me, I think the number one thing we should focus on immediately is energy independence. And why? Because I think this underpins so many other problems. Number one, obviously, everyone paying more at the pump is a real drain on their financial resources and their ability to get ahead or their ability to make ends meet with a fixed income. I want to make sure we reduce those costs by increasing American energy independence. Secondarily, though, and just as importantly, by the way, American energy independence empowers us to be stronger, to be bolder when it comes to these foreign threats, right? If we have the energy that we can export to Europe, Europe is less dependent on Russia. If we have the energy, right, required to defend our interests in the South China Sea, then we can be less concerned about what China is going to do and more concerned about what we need to do. Energy independence in this country profoundly changes not only our domestic economy, but also our foreign situation. And I want to make sure that we do everything we can to invest in this country. Just 20 years ago, right, we were importing millions of barrels every single day, and we relied on the most untrustworthy of friends to support us by providing the oil every single day. And over the course of 20 years, because of the American worker, because of American ingenuity, because of American natural resources, we became energy independent. We became a net energy exporter. We became the world's largest natural gas producer. This is a tremendous asset, and I do not want to see us fritter it away by failed policies out of the Biden administration, by failed progressive pushes towards Green New Deal. We need to harness this great advantage that we have in this country and maximize it to the use of our domestic citizenry, but also our foreign relationships.
Why do you think your colleagues on the left don't recognize the importance of this initiative to have energy independence here in America?
It is unbelievable to me how misguided many of my colleagues' pushes are, right? They pretend as though electric car batteries are made out of rainbows and Skittles instead of unearthed out of the ground in some of the most dangerous places in the world, right? Just as we do with natural gas. They pretend that car batteries are of infinite life and don't need some sort of termination at the end where they're going to be either put back into the ground or recycled differently. The reality is they are essentially trying to force the American people to say that which we have in abundance here, oil and natural gas, and have the ability to pull out of the ground by virtue of hard American investment and hard American workers. We don't want you to use that, but we really want you to use these batteries only that are mined in China, rare earths. About 65% of the globe's controlling rare earths are in China alone. This is just a terrible trade for the American consumer. It's a terrible trade for the American worker, and it's a terrible trade for American prosperity going forward. I want to see people decide with their pocketbooks how they want to purchase cars, where they want to purchase cars, what type of energy those cars are going to ride on, not more pushes from a misguided understanding about where electricity and electric batteries come from out of Washington, force people to choose what cars.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you so much for saying it. You said that really well, and we agree with you here at AMAC. I know those listening agree entirely. So thank you so much for your leadership, for your inspiration, and thank you for your time today, Congressman. What a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you for what you're doing on this podcast, but what you and your organization and all the members are doing across this country to educate and help get engaged more Americans in this fight.
Well, thank you, because you've offered us some good lessons and reinforced what many AMAC members believe and hope. So keep leading, and we'll certainly see you again later in 2022 as AMAC is there with you fighting the good fight. Thank you, Congressman. And thank you to everyone out there listening to us today. Thanks for tuning in. If you haven't downloaded the AMAC News app, you can watch, you can listen to this show, you can track breaking news right from your smartphone. You'll get the stories that you won't see or hear from in mainstream media. So please make sure to hit that subscribe button, follow, like, and share wherever you are on social media. Until next time, I'm Rebecca Weber. This is your podcast, Better for America. Thank you for being here, everyone. Have a great day, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you for listening to the Better for America podcast. To learn more about AMAC and all it has to offer, visit us at www.amac.us.